My name is Gavin Cleespies, and I am the Director of Programs, Exhibitions, and Community Partnerships for the Massachusetts Historical Society. I would like to extend a special welcome to anyone who might be joining us for the first time today. The Mass Historical Society, if you're not familiar with it, is the oldest historical society in America. We were founded in 1791 and have been an independent, nonprofit institution dedicated to collecting, preserving, publishing, sharing our state and our nation's history for the past 229 years. In these days of social distancing, we have taken to hosting virtual events, and we have online events planned for every week from now through through the end of July and into August. Our next program is this Friday afternoon at 2 o'clock. We will hear from John Larson from Purdue University, who will be speaking about his new book, Laid Waste, The Culture of Exploitation in Early America. Following that, next Thursday, we'll hear from Donna Harrington-Luker, who will speak on her book, Books for Idle Hours, 19th Century Publishing and the Rise of Summer Reading. That was obviously a program we planned while we thought everyone was going to be on the beach. Today we have a great program. We are joined by a good friend to MHS, Professor Allison Lange. Professor Lange is an associate professor of history at the Wentworth Institute of Technology. She received her PhD in history from Brandeis University and her BA from the University of Georgia. Her work studies the long 19th century with an interest in gender, power, and political images in the United States. She also has a long history with MHS, having been the guest curator of our fabulous exhibition, Can She Do It? Massachusetts Debates a Woman's Right to Vote. She will give a brief presentation and then will be joined in conversation by MHS's president, Catherine Allgor. President Allgor has been with MHS since 2017. She received her PhD from Yale University and her undergraduate degree from Mount Holyoke College. Prior to her work at MHS, she was the director of education at the Huntington Library in California, and before that was a professor of history at UC Presidential Chair at the University of California, Riverside. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Allison Lange and Catherine Allgor.
Hello, glad to be here today. And I am here to talk about my new book, Picturing Political Power, Images in the Women's Suffrage Movement. And before I dive into it, I want to remind us that, one of the things that's happening this year in the midst of all of this pandemic is actually the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, which was ratified in 1920. So you might have seen a lot of suffrage programming in the last few months. Now it's probably all online, but that is one of the reasons there's a lot of new exciting literature happening right now. And when we think about suffrage, one thing I want to note is that we're thinking about specifically women's voting rights. So in the 19th century, suffrage was a term that we used to discuss male suffrage or Black male suffrage with the 15th Amendment. Even if today we often think about it with women's voting rights. So we're thinking about women's voting rights today. And we're also thinking about images. And a couple of the things that I really wanted to talk about in my book, and I'm going to speak for about 15 minutes before we dive into a Q&A with Catherine. One is that images are political tools. They are images to kind of shape ideas about the way we think about gender. When you think about the term president, for example, you probably think of a man, probably a white man with a lot of power. And those kinds of images that we conjure up are a response to a lot of the images that we regularly see. And so these images that we look at in the past have that same kind of power. They are not, factual illustrations that we can take at face value and just simply drop into a historical text. They're images that we need to analyze and think about the ways that they're in conversation with each other and about the ways that they are promoting particular ideas. So that's one thing that I'm unearthing in this book, which is, thinking about these women's rights images in a different way than we previously had. And the other thing that I want to think about is the way that suffragists really launched one of the first modern national visual campaigns. Today we think about images as obviously being central to a campaign. We look at social media all the time and see how our political leaders are crafting a public image for themselves. And it's important to know that by the mid-19th century, with new image technologies, suffragists, presidents, political campaigns were also trying to do the same thing. And one of the interesting things about the suffrage movement is that they constantly evolved their message and the types of images they used with the new technology that was available. So I'm going to start by showing you some of these images that we've got here today. All right. So one that I would like to start with is probably a little earlier than we might expect, but I want to give you a sense of the ways that women were represented in the 18th century politically, right? You can probably conjure up a portrait of George Washington in your mind. There were very few portraits of individual women that were circulating among Americans during the 18th century. This is the kind of portrait of a picture, this cartoon that circulated to comment on, to make fun of these women who had decided to boycott tea. It was printed in London. It's mocking these women who have decided to sign this boycott. It's suggesting that they are, you can see this woman with the gavel who looks it's not a very flattering representation. There's a woman in the backdrop who's drinking alcohol from a punch bowl. And we can see that they have abandoned their duties. They are ignoring the child underneath the table. And so these gender roles are being reversed, right? So these women are ignoring the things that they are supposed to be doing. The other thing that's really important to notice in this scene is that we see a Black woman off behind the woman with a gavel, kind of looking over her shoulder, interested in also participating in this process. And so the suggestion is here by the artist Philip Daw that if women start participating in politics, like they are in this particular scene, not only will the gender hierarchy break down, but so will the racial hierarchy and even the economic system of slavery that she is intending to represent here. So that was 1775, and I'm fast forwarding quite far to 1851. By 1851, we've got this is 3 years after the Seneca Falls Convention and the Declaration of Sentiments. This is a year after the very first Women's Rights Convention happened in Worcester, Massachusetts. And so this is a moment when women's rights activism is on the rise in a big way. It's also a moment when there's brand new image technologies that makes it even cheaper to reproduce these images for even broader audiences. So we've got this fabulous, complicated political cartoon. And we have this woman in the center who's kind of the president of this supposed women's rights organization. We see on the wall behind her an illustration of the Women's Rights Convention. So we know that's what she's here for. She has her hand very patronizingly on who is probably her husband, leaning over, doing this domestic labor of sewing, mending clothes. She's, again, ignoring her child. He has a sign that says, "No more Papa and Mama." In the background, we have two women, workers, laborers, probably one enslaved woman and one domestic worker, suggesting that, again, if women win rights, they will force men to do women's tasks, menial tasks, like taking care of these clothes. But also it can upend this class hierarchy and racial hierarchy that we see here. So all of these things are mixed up together. And these are just two images that I'm showing you today, but these were two of thousands of many, many types of the same exact images that people encountered over and over and over again. And people came to suffrage lectures, for example, saying, "Oh, actually, I expected Lucy Stone to look far more masculine." Like these expectations, these stereotypes of women's rights activists were very much embedded in American culture. And so by the 1860s, we have a new type of technology that is available to Americans, but not only Americans all around the world. And that's the wet plate process. And that makes photographs far more reproducible than ever before. Previously, there were daguerreotypes. You could create one unique print, so you can't sit for thousands of prints and sell them. That's not a very viable way to circulate your portrait. But we have Sojourner Truth, and before her, really, Frederick Douglass, paving the way and deciding that as anti-slavery reformers and as women's rights reformers, they're going to distribute their portraits in order to create a different image of what these reformers look like. They are responding to racist caricatures that were also very popular in American society at this time. And you can see Sojourner Truth, who was born an enslaved woman but became a prominent women's rights lecturer. She's claiming dignity as a reformer in this picture, right? She's sitting at this table. It's kind of a domestic scene with flowers and a book and knitting. You can tell she's, more of a worker, right? She has this plain white wrap on, a very simple dress, at least in 19th century terms, a very simple dress. And that's in comparison to, on the right, we have Stanton and Anthony, who a few years later, in 1870, go to Napoleon Serigny's studio and they take their portrait. Most of the time, women did not take portraits together if they were unrelated in the 19th century. So this is really a statement of their movement here. And you can tell that they're far less concerned with looking kind of like respectable and domestic. They are more willing to look like they're aggressive leaders. And so Sojourner Truth is as a Black woman kind of needing to depict her respectability in a way that these other women don't quite have to. And Susan B. Anthony goes on to really create iconography of the movement with portraits. This is from 1900, and this is her seated at her desk with many of the portraits that she included in series like The History of Women's Suffrage, but also from that she sold with newspapers like The Revolution. And so she is the reason, really, why we have so many portraits of a lot of these women who we actually can identify. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, for example, is sitting on her desk in front of her. And we can see them in our museums, in our archives. These are the women that we are most easily able to find. And we have Anthony really to thank for that. And so one thing to note is that as women these individual suffragists are becoming even more well-known, these anti-women's rights caricatures are also making sure that they are caricaturing specific women's rights activists. You can tell this is Anthony here. She looks exactly like this original portrait of her that this is clearly copying. And the themes are very much the same too. We have, one of my favorite 19th century tropes in women's rights cartoons, which is a man carrying a baby. This was, popular in many cartoons, the suggestion that if women win the right to vote, men will have to take care of the children. This was, to us, kind of an unremarkable thing, but in the 19th century, it was kind of the end of the world to imagine a man carrying a baby and having to do the groceries, right? So this is, to 19th century viewers, something that would have seemed kind of dystopian. But to us, maybe we wouldn't remark upon the women rallying in the background, which women did not do in the 1870s, or the policewoman, Anthony's shorter skirt, which was also very short for the 19th century, her fairly aggressive pose. She almost looks like a Civil War general with her umbrella as a sword. The artist really must not have liked Anthony at all. Anthony often took profile portraits, and that's because she had an eye deformity, an eye issue. And in this close-up version, you can see that the artist actually replicated that here. So it's really kind of a deep cut into Anthony, and like some things that she really felt very self-conscious about. And so in the early years, suffragists were often doing this work on their own, really working to distribute these images on their own. But by the turn of the century, they actually created these national press committees particularly for the National American Women's Suffrage Association. They hired publicity professionals. They actually had entire art publicity committees. They had their own publishing company. And all of these things were to distribute text and pamphlets and posters. And they hired a new generation of professional female artists to kind of contribute to this conversation in the ways that they really wanted to. And one of them was local Boston resident, Blanche Ames, with this one, Double the Power of the Home, 2 good votes are better than 1. And you can see that she's very much continuing kind of Anthony's idea of emphasizing that white women are leading the movement and that white women want the vote and that we want to enfranchise white women. And we want to enfranchise specifically, according to Blanche Ames, this particular kind of white woman, right? She is clearly well off enough to be at home caring for her children, not out working. She has a God bless our home sign in the background, suggesting kind of like probably a Protestant Christianity. This home is ideal. There's like a kettle on the stove. And this was not only published in women's rights newspapers like those earlier portraits were. These were published in mainstream newspapers by the 1910s. So you can see even there that the shift in favor of suffrage is happening. This is another great image by Rose ONeil, another female artist that grew through the ranks, just giving the same type of message. And I do want to emphasize, because I am speaking about a little bit about the MHS collections tonight, which have wonderful anti-suffrage collections, which I would argue are very important to understanding the suffrage movement. This is an example of one of those. So if the suffragists are arguing that the vote will make them better mothers and that they will be better able to take care of their families, anti-suffragists are still arguing that women will abandon their children, right? So this man is coming home to his very sad children, and there's a Votes for Women sign saying, "Back sometime this evening." And these are very much in conversation with each other. So while the suffragists have kind of changed gears, they're no longer thinking about portraying themselves as equal political leaders, particularly for the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Anti-suffragists are still thinking about the ways that this isn't going to work, right? Here's another great one, which was kind of the main image for our suffrage exhibition, and it is, "Can she do it?" which suggests that this woman cannot juggle both caring for her home, cooking, cleaning, and the ballot, right? And if you've seen any kind of modern articles about, can women still have it all, you've probably seen a 21st century stock photograph version of exactly this image. So anti-suffragists were really emphasizing that they were the more feminine one. And this is another piece from the Mass Historical Society collections that really stands out. Of course, Massachusetts was actually the home to the nation's first anti-suffrage association, founded in 1895, and its headquarters were eventually based just down the street from the Massachusetts Historical Society. And so a lot of these images really sidestepped women of color. Anthony never included a portrait of Sojourner Truth in her History of Women's Suffrage series, even though she had one, but she didn't want the movement to be represented by Black women. And the people who came to power and led these organizations after that did the same. They really emphasized that white women were fighting for the vote and that we should enfranchise white women. Mary Church Terrell is really interesting because she very much is someone who kind of comes of age in the late 19th century. She is one of the first African-American women to achieve an undergraduate degree, and she becomes a leader in the women's rights movement, particularly based in Washington, D.C. And so she develops her own public image. These white suffragists are not willing to kind of feature her work and highlight her as a political leader, a respectable, dignified leader that she was. And so she does that herself. And actually this wins her significant respect from white suffragists. She speaks at the National American Women's Suffrage Association several times, and she is the first president of the National Association of Colored Women, which was founded in 1896. And it's really important that we think about this because she's creating these images in order to counter the kinds of things that people are still seeing in the press. This is an example of one of the racist caricatures that people were encountering. And this is about the 1913 parade in Washington, D.C., which Alice Paul and the suffrage organization decided would have to be segregated. And you can see that this is a commentary on the white women who don't want the Black women to march with them, but it's also still critiquing these Black political leaders who want to participate. It's not, it's offering, racist, exaggerated features to show that it's diminishing both the white suffragists and the suffragists of color in this particular political cartoon, which was from a satirical magazine published in 1913. But Mary Church Terrell works really hard to kind of counter these pictures. And I think it's a really vital move that she makes. On the one side, we see a portrait of her from a pamphlet for one of her talks. And on the other side, we have this idealized vision of what the new Negro woman was supposed to look like from 1904, Voice of the Negro. And Terrell was very visible in the Black civil rights community. So I do kind of wonder if John Adams had her in mind, or people like her in mind when he was creating this sketch. And I want to share finally this wonderful, unique image from the Mass Historical Society, because it is the only image that I found in, over 10 years of image research at archives across the country in Britain. It's the only image I've ever found that argues that Black women need the vote to be good mothers. And I think it's really valuable to think about. It shows a woman with a bat saying federal constitution, and she is beating down segregation, Jim Crow laws, and the grandfather clause. And she's doing this in order to protect these children in her skirts. It's really important to note this was not published by a suffrage organization. This was actually published by the Crisis. This was published by the NAACP. It was featured in their magazine, but also as a broadside, which is the version we see here. And we see it called the South's Battalion of Death, what votes for women means to the South. And the argument for not, featuring Black women in suffrage propaganda was that if we want to win Southern voters, we don't want to emphasize that we are fighting for the vote for women of color. But this does exactly the opposite, right? It says that we need women of color to be voters in order to create a more equal society. So if we were, there are far more images in the book, but if we were here in person today, I'd be able to give you my cute little book cards and give you this little code. If you're interested in the book, feel free to use this 20% off code for more. But as we're kind of thinking about moving forward, the two things that I would say I'd like people to take away from this conversation is that images have power. In the past, in the present, these images that we see all day, every day, they mean something and they can change the way we think about things. And women's rights activists have been using images for decades, for generations, in order to create a more just society and still try to negotiate the ways that women are political leaders in our society.
Hello, everybody. I'm Catherine Allgor. Dr. Lange, thank you so much for that, and congratulations on your book. It really is wonderful. Very important, I think, contribution to the literature, but also really very readable, very well written. So
I'm glad to hear it.
I love that you sort of ended your talk with what we should be taking away from this. So as historians, we find ourselves telling our students, telling our audiences, it's important that you, whoever you are, to know your stories. And then often we don't necessarily go on to say why. And sometimes that's because of who we're talking to. So I wonder if you would elaborate on this idea of what do American women, I'm going to say women, but Americans altogether, learn from this? What would you like people to take from this study?
So I think it depends if we're thinking about historians or elsewhere, otherwise. But I think that one thing in 2020 that stands out to me, especially given our current moment on so many levels, is that these women were persistent. And that is something that I really appreciated studying. And it reminds you that, if you're perhaps participating in a social movement, like these women spend their entire lives doing this work. And many of them never even saw the 19th Amendment pass. So I think that that's a really nice, a really positive message to think about, from this research. But I also think that it reminds us that these conversations about the ways that race, that class, that other identities have splintered, have really harmed women's rights movements, how they kind of continue to affect women's activism today, right? We see some of the same fractures along some of the same lines, and part of that is rooted in that past conversations, past organizations, this institutional, memory of how things have gone before.
And that actually was a really compelling strength of your book, because you had to juggle something that's a little bit, which is that there's a lot of similarities from the way that people talked about women in politics, from that crazy cartoon about the Tea Party, all the way up to stressing in female candidates their relationships as mothers and sisters and wives. And when you have a culture or a historical phenomenon that's got a lot of similarities to today, I find you always have to be very careful, as you were, to point out the differences. In other words, it's not just the same old, same old. So, and you do a great job kind of juggling that, balancing that. Can you talk a little bit about the issues there and sort of how you handled them as a historian?
Sure. I mean, I think that it was a really tough thing to decide how much of the present to bring into a history book, as it always is. But I think it's also important to recognize the ways that, for example, in my work, past visual themes are still part of, even our stock photographs that we encounter. And so when we're thinking about, there's a vignette about Clinton's campaign and her choice to wear pantsuits rather than more feminine attire, and connecting that to the first woman to run for president, Victoria Woodhull's campaign in 1872, where I have this fabulous photograph of her, leaning on this desk, wearing this top hat, very much choosing a far more masculine aesthetic. And I think that when we're thinking about the ways that these women have to present themselves in order to kind of win some version of authority, which we often associate with manliness, right? So we're wearing kind of more masculine attire. I think that, we see those themes are clear, but they're also very different, right? Victoria Woodhull would not have worn pants, right? She was not even officially a real candidate for president because she was not old enough. She also spent election day in prison. But, Hillary Clinton ran a very different campaign in so many ways. And she had to really balance her femininity with these kind of masculine representations of authority. And I think that since the 2016 election, we have had a major shift in the way that female candidates represent themselves. And I think that we're seeing a wider range of the ways that people choose to kind of create their public image, right? Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is like the best example of kind of this, ultra feminine version, detailing her skincare routine, for example. And that's, it's really interesting to see how people are kind of trying to push back against the kind of balancing act that we've seen happen for so long.
So in fact, I have to say there's a great paragraph which talks about the use of the feminine, motherly as a version of a persona that has political authority. And it is a skilled historian who can get Phyllis Schlafly and Michelle Obama in the same paragraph, let me just say. So I'd like to turn to something that I found myself being uncomfortable about, and I was kind of interested in that. So one of the things we used to say about the founding generation, so the founding generation, the framers, can come in for a lot of criticism because of who they left behind. And what we used to tell ourselves to kind of comfort ourselves was, oh, well, they just did what they could. And then afterwards, they kind of laid the groundwork for everybody else, women, Black people, people of the lower class, to come in and get civil rights. I used to call it the buffet school of history, right? They lay out the buffet and we all come in and we take our turns. I was reminded of that when it was so clear that it wasn't that the white suffragists were just going along and leaving Black women behind, and Black women were waiting outside the dining room so they could come in, but they actively excluded them. Mm-hmm. I mean, it was hard to read. And I think, especially since I, as a historian, certainly knew that things got really ugly with Frederick Douglass and with Black male suffrage, the kind of reaction to that. But the really conscious decision not to include these women of color into this movement was really very, very painful. And I wondered how it was for you to write about that and what your thoughts were about that.
Yes, it was a really tough thing to think through, you know, why did they make these choices? And why did, even when these choices were made, why did Black women still choose to collaborate with them when they could? I mean, Mary Church Terrell is one of the best examples of this. She knows full well that these women are not fighting for the vote for her. And yet she still chooses to address their conventions and, you know, do her best to try and convince them to change their minds. I mean, when after the 19th Amendment passed in 1920, she writes Alice Paul, who is the head of the National Women's Party, and she says, you know, women in the South, Black women in the South, are not able to register to vote. You need to next fight to make sure the 19th Amendment is actually enforced. And Paul just writes her back saying, not my problem, essentially. This is not something that I am concerned about. And so, yeah, it's devastating to read that and then have to find a way to create a useful narrative out of that. But I do think one of the things that I think, as you said, it's not that Black women were waiting outside, you know, waiting to be invited in. They were creating these movements on their own, right? Like, one of the things that I think is true is that Sojourner Truth inspires Susan B. Anthony to realize how important portraits are to kind of creating a public persona. They are very much kind of innovators and activists and creating their own movements and their own organizations when these white suffrage organizations are not meeting their needs.
Yeah, so I'm going to ask one more question, and then we'll bring everybody else in. But I have to say, also looking at the suffrage movement, the suffrage movement of the women of color, as you know, my own work is about women who are political before you have the vote. And what's so interesting is about the suffrage activities of women of color was it was so much more than the vote, or so not about the vote. So white women, certainly by the 20th century, it's all about getting the vote, but Black women have a more expansive idea of what freedom means.
Yes, that's very true. And that's recognized. I mean, we could go pretty far back to think about that, but even Sojourner Truth gave a speech, you know, the kind of complicated backdrop of the Ain't I a Woman speech, which has a very complicated history, but essentially, you know, thinking about the ways that race and gender are intertwined. Mary Church Terrell followed her, calling it her double handicap, thinking about the ways that race and gender were part of her activism. I mean, we could do like a wonderful Black women's intellectual history, you know, foundations to today's intersectionality, you know, idea. This is very much kind of part of that thread. And so, yes, these women were fighting for, you know, when Mary Church Terrell headed the National Association of Colored Women in 1896, the founding of which Harriet Tubman attended. So it's this like multi-generational gathering in Washington, D.C. You know, they're advocating against lynching. They are seeing Black men losing the right to vote in the 1890s. Plessy versus Ferguson is at the Supreme Court, segregation is now, legal. And, so this is a moment where they're not just fighting for the right to vote, though they want it. And let no one say that the NACW was not a suffrage organization. They elected a suffragist to be their president. They want it, but it is not the only thing. They are concerned about violence. They are concerned about the ways their children are being educated. So many things all wrapped up into one organization with very little resources. Terrell asked the organization, can we spare some money to create some publicity materials? And they're like, we just can't. We can't do it. So that's why she ends up really doing it on her own.
Yes. So, Gavin, I think you and Sarah are going to help us with our audience questions.
Yes, we can start with a question. There's a question here from Megan, and I believe you might know this, Megan. Can you say something about the way our current explosion of new visual media, new social media is similar or different from the explosion in print media and photographic reproduction in the 19th century? Why does it feel so much worse now? Or did people then feel overwhelmed that they were being manipulated? Did conspiracy theories spread then too in the new media of the day?
Yeah, so I think that a few things are very different. For example, in the 19th century, when we're thinking about the ways that people are accessing or like seeing their public figures, most people are buying a photograph and sticking in a photograph album, and that's how they find, how they know who what President Lincoln looked like. And they would include a portrait of someone like Jefferson Davis in that same album, because that was the only way to find out who these political leaders, what they looked like. We didn't have the kind of access to just Google someone's image and see the news in the way that we do now. And I think that with the women's rights movement, with women's rights movements of the 21st century, one great example is with the Women's March from 2017, where, the organizers decide to hire artists because they want to create posters and other visual materials for marchers to be able to print out as a poster and just kind of bring with them, to convey their particular messages. And ultimately, that's not the images that stuck with us from the Women's March. It's the images of individuals creating homemade posters with their own particular slogans, their own particular ideas. And so we have, this emphasis on kind of an individual's vision of, feminism or modern social movements. It's much more, it's less about, a suffrage organization creating that image and kind of sticking to it and keeping this professional image. And it's much more about the individual kind of creating their own and promoting it their own on social media.
Yeah, I loved that. So I've never even seen them. They were beautiful official logos, and they were very much in the Obama Hope framework, and they were lovely. Mm-hmm. And then the image of what people were really saying, which I can't even say some of these things, what they were really saying was very striking. But the other thing, just to also address the question, it's very different. So, Lincoln gets the picture done, and that's the picture you have. But when anybody has a camera phone and people are going out to the gym, that it would be very hard to maintain that kind of, like, this is me and that, the image of you. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Suffragists, when we think about Susan B. Anthony, she's not having covert photographs taken of her doing something she doesn't want them to see. Susan Sojourner Truth is another good example. We know that that portrait conveys is the type of portrait that she wanted us to see, because she sat for multiple different portraits with the same kinds of poses, the same kinds of clothes, the same kinds of props. So she really wanted you to see her in this particular light. There's no in progress, her giving a lecture, and someone snapping a picture, an unflattering photo of her.
So we have an audience member named Bill who has raised his hand, so I'm going to allow him to speak.
I was surprised. I saw all these things, those posters about how things are going to change. Of course, men are going to be carrying the babies, blah, 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 blah. Has American politics actually changed significantly since women had the vote? I mean, has it really changed?
So I think that's a good question. And I think it's particularly a good question with the suffragist propaganda in mind, right? So the suffragists, especially the National American Women Suffrage Association, argued that if women voted, they would essentially vote as a bloc and surely agree on exactly the things that they needed to happen to improve schools, to, improve, cities, to make the government less corrupt, et cetera, because women were supposedly more moral and virtuous and all of these things that they're, emphasizing. And if we buy that, then that's not a good bar, right? Because even if some suffragists truly believed that message was, would really happen, that would really come true, it was orchestrated by publicity professionals who knew that this would be an appealing message for people who were kind of on the fence, people who they needed to convince, which is male voters, right? So I think that if we're thinking about women as individuals who are never going to vote as a bloc because they all have different ideas about the best ways, even just to run a school, how a school in your community should run, then, we can expect, women to come in as a bloc and vote a particular way. And so in that way, I think we should not take the suffragist propaganda as at face value, and think about the ways that they kind of made us think that women voters would change society in a major way. And they didn't, right? And in the ways that they had, I guess, hoped.
I should point out, though, in the spirit of Bill's question, as you point out, after the Women's March in 2017, someone did an article about what happened when all the women left and men had to take care of their own children, which is kind of nutty.
Yeah, and I'm sure, maybe some of our audience has read the article from the Lily in the Washington Post last week or so about women during this coronavirus pandemic who, there's an example of a woman who had to dissolve her business because her husband refused to take care of their children. And so, it's something that, as you say, we are still negotiating that aspect of it, right? That idea that women should do particular tasks and men should do particular tasks. And the article that you referenced for the Women's March was from the New York Times, a newspaper that we perceive to be as particularly liberal. And so I think that, it's still part of our society.
So there is a question typed in that says, do you think the biting satire of many anti-suffrage cartoons was effective? How do we look with modern eyes on images from more than 100 years ago and understand how effective they were then?
Yes, I think it was really effective, and it's because I saw so much of it. I mean, I could show you a slideshow with thousands of images from the 19th century, but we're not here for that today. And it was effective. It made people laugh. People were afraid of this change, but this made them laugh. And people must have purchased it in great numbers because so many different magazines, print companies sold it. So I do think it was effective. It was just kind of part of the culture. It was something that people probably barely thought of because the assumption was that women would not vote, that women should not be in politics. So when these publishers are printing these things for their readers, they're assuming that their readers will agree with them for much of the 19th century.
Willa has raised her hand, so we're gonna click on her and allow her to talk. So Willa, you can unmute yourself.
Hi. First of all, thank you. That was a wonderful talk, and I really enjoyed hearing it. The other thing I wanted to ask about is as you move into the 1920s and the sort of beginning of the ERA and first wave feminist era, how are those parties reacting to these images, using the same language, fighting against it? Because sort of in early feminism, as you're trying to fight for equality, how do they deal with all these highly feminized images of women coming into the suffrage movement?
That's a great question. And I think that, in women's history, we often look at these generations, right? So one generation is constantly rejecting the previous generation's vision of feminism. And so in the 1920s, they're looking at these suffrage images of these super, mother-oriented, more emphasis on morality and virtue. And they're saying that is so outdated. It's over. Like, that is so quickly pushed to the side by women's rights activists in the 1920s, just as, in the 1910s, people were pushing aside the kind of political leadership portraits that Anthony had promoted, years earlier, right? Instead, these, Alice Paul, International Women's Party, these female picketers who were the very first ever groups to picket the White House, even in the 21st century, we probably expect to see people picketing the White House, just because that's something that's part of our national political culture. But they were the first to do it. And so this idea of women kind of claiming their space and being, being able to be young and pretty and not having to emphasize their motherhood is very much something that, is far more prominent in the years after the 19th Amendment, once the suffrage movement ends.
Yeah, it's the flapper, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
The new woman. I mean, this dowdy mother who stays at home and cares for her children. She's very much swept aside incredibly quickly, which just goes to show just how much this is propaganda. This is, an idealized vision of what these suffragists had to sell.
So Michael typed in, I'm teaching 20th century US history this semester, and I just watched the show Miss America. Do you bring in this type of analysis of images to explain the defeat of the Equal Rights Amendment in the 1920s and 1970s?
Yeah, I'm only on episode 3, so I can only speak to that, but...
Let me just say, it's good and depressing.
That's why I'm taking it in small doses.
Excellent and depressing.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
And so I think that's a great question, particularly since the ERA movement very much plays upon the ideas that anti-suffragists had established many decades before, right? There's the famous portrait of the Stop ERA activists, carrying their pies to the White House, right? It's this movement where they're leaning into this emphasis on women need to stay in the home. And whereas women's rights activists are very much, rejecting that idea. But that's what ultimately wins, right? This fear that women will lose their privilege, their kind of higher morality, their kind of, higher status as a result of the passage of the ERA. So when we're thinking about these images of, Phyllis Schlafly, going in her, her perfectly coordinated suits, and to bring this, pie to emphasize that she's a homemaker, it's really complicated. It's really drawing back to the anti-suffragists. I think it's also really important to note that, these anti-suffragists, many of them actually went on to run for office, because they were political activists as anti-suffragists, and I think they realized they liked it. And, Phyllis Schlafly is advocating that women stay in the home, but she is a political activist, and she loved it, I would say, So I think that there's this really complicated tension among anti-suffrage or anti-women's rights leaders, anti-ERA leaders, that is still really interesting to see today.
Yeah, and on the flip side of it, the portrayal of the pro-ERA as ugly, old,
yes,
undateable,
humorless too, right?
I mean, it's just yeah. But stick with it, Dr. Lange. You're gonna love it and be depressed.
Yeah, there's a great scene I've already seen where they say, "Oh, feminists don't have fun," and they show them at a party at the Guggenheim. It's like there's clearly commentary that's happening here, and that as the question suggests, it dates back far longer than we wish it did.
All right, well, Jim has raised his hand, so we can allow Jim to speak.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. It's been great. How much involvement was the suffrage movement with the prohibition movement, which was contemporaneous, and how much success of that was due to the prohibition movement?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the temperance movement was a major part of the suffrage movement. So Frances Willard was kind of one of the most famous Women's Christian Temperance Union presidents. She endorsed suffrage, and she had the largest essentially suffrage organization in the late 19th century, long before, far larger than NASA was. I mean, they really created the kind of organizational model that the National American Women's Suffrage Association adopted. They were the first ones to have their own publishing company and their own press organization, and create this kind of idea. And they're also kind of helping to establish the idea that women are more moral figures too, which is ultimately the rhetoric that suffragists really adopt in the early 20th century. So you're right to recognize the significant overlap that these two movements had together. And in fact, in the 1910s, when suffrage is becoming an ever more likely possibility, people are concerned, before, of course, the 18th Amendment passes, that if women win the right to vote, that they will no longer, that they will immediately pass prohibition laws. So it's very much tied together.
So Nancy typed in a question. She said, do you think white women excluded black women in the right to vote movement for the same reasons the Continental Congress decided against addressing slavery? Their agenda would fall apart if blacks were included.
So suffragists, white suffragists in particular, and even more specifically the National American Women's Suffrage Association, kind of developed this idea of a Southern strategy. This idea that if they emphasized that white women were going to win the vote and didn't, bring black women's clubs under their big umbrella and emphasize that they were fighting for the vote for black women, that they would get more Southern states to support the amendment. And so we know now that wasn't successful. They really didn't get very many Southern states at all, even to ratify the amendment, much less pass suffrage before the 19th Amendment happened. And so they certainly think that it's a good political strategy. And the National Women's Party, for example, has segregated parades. And though it's still really important to note that, people like Ida B. Wells and Mary Church Terrell were there anyway. But yes, they really think that they will win more support, that it is politically expedient if they decide to, as much as possible, exclude black women from their cause.
Mimi has raised her hand. So, Mimi, would you like to ask a question?
Sure, thank you, Gavin. Actually, the questions are for both Allison and Catherine, because the question came out from Catherine's question to Allison about the women of color. We know, African American women were not able to vote until civil rights movement. President Johnson signed the voting rights, the law, right? So obviously, this disparity between white women and also in the history, you have Chinese Exclusion Act, Indian Exclusion Act. So women of color have never been on the same footing with white women. Now we are in the conjuncture of this centennial, women's suffrage centennial. Of course, you can say it's a landmark in terms of numbers, 100, right? But what is the uniqueness, the significance of the centennial? Because we find ourselves in a browner America, much browner than 100 years ago. So I know, Catherine, I could tell you had a lot in mind when you were asking Allison that question. So I would love to hear both of you, elaborate a little bit the significance of women's suffrage centennial in a browner America today.
So I'll jump in because I think Dr. Lange is a perfect example. I think the worth of this centennial is it gives us a chance to look at our history and really know it. And it's books like Dr. Lange's that help us know our history. I'm thinking about our very present moment and what's happening now in the streets, police brutality, the use of Black bodies. it's surprising to some people, but not to people who know their history. Anybody who knows American history, who have studied American history in the last 20 years, knows that this is just an extension of Jim Crow. This has been going on. This is a long-standing issue. So I would say, Mimi, that in the same way, I think it's an occasion for us to start paying attention to what scholars like Dr. Lange offer so that we can actually learn our history. And as I said, when I read deeply about the treatment of these women of color who were not just ignored, but, you know, excluded, it took me down a road, and I'm very appreciative of it. So I think that's the really the good part of any kind of centennial celebration, but I don't know what Dr. Lange thinks.
Well, I certainly agree with you on that. You know, revisiting these stories we think we know and finding out that they were far more complex, far more diverse than we thought of. But I think the question is a really important one that actually has been quite central to conversations among suffrage historians at the various events that we've had. You know, what is the value of the 19th Amendment? The 19th Amendment did not grant all women the right to vote. The 19th Amendment only prohibited discrimination, voter discrimination based on sex, which is why, you know, laws like poll taxes and literacy tests and, you know, the Chinese Exclusion Act, which prevented Chinese people from gaining citizenship, why it didn't apply to those women. And so I think that when we're thinking about the 19th Amendment, it's important to think about it as a milestone, because it certainly was a milestone. It was a significant step forward, but it was only one part of this much longer conversation that we're having in the United States about voting rights. I mean, even in, you know, today, we're talking about what should felons vote? You know, do we need an ID in order to vote? You know, we're still having conversations about who should vote. And I think that it's important to realize that those who votes changes, and that we still need to be consciously thinking about who we want to vote and advocating for those people to have that right.
Great. Thank you very much, Professor Lange and President Allgor. Unless you have any further comments, I think that we should be conscious of people's time and move on. So, and thank everyone for coming. If you are interested in purchasing Allison's book, the U Chicago Press is offering a 20% discount. We actually have a slightly different code, which was Lang, that you can use, but I imagine both of them will work. Also, again, if you enjoyed the program, we encourage you to support our efforts at the Massachusetts Historical Society. So I hope everyone has a wonderful evening and enjoys the beautiful, beautiful weather. At least if you're in the Boston area, it's beautiful weather.